Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Politdigm channel. My name is Red, and today we're back with another episode of Politdigm Reads Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific by Friedrich Engels. In this episode, of course, we're not actually reading the book. However, we are just going to look into what the book talks about and doing a little bit of a self reflection on the topics that the book talks about. And basically, this is supposed to serve as a little bit of a summary, but also it should also give you an idea of what the book is about, in case you watch this episode as the first episode rather than listening to the first three parts. So I always try to make these last little episodes into something that works both for those who have just finished listening to the book or those who want to start listening to the book. So I'm just going to go into the topics and the ideas that Frederick talks about in his book. Of course, this is not supposed to be like a super um, I don't know if the correct term would be faithful, but like a good way to learn about the book, I guess. If you want to actually know what is in the book, the actual contents of it, and learn about it, I recommend you read the book, of course, or that you watch other videos on YouTube which talk about socialism, utopian, and scientific, which are much more in depth and much better research. This is just kind of a little conversation, as if you had just asked your friend who read the book about it and they're just kind of talking to you about it. It's something more informal. So if you want a more formal representation of the book, there are great videos out there, like one by Marxism Today or Marxist Today, where you can search up its socialism, utopian, and socialism or scientific utopian science, something like that. Just search up the term and you'll find it surely enough. And it's a great video. I think it's like 9 minutes long, and it goes into the topics, and it's a great representation of this book. But before I get into the episode, of course, if you enjoy our content and would like to support us, you can do so over at Patreon. If you would like to support us in non monetary ways, you can learn how to do so over at our website. The link is in the description below. And of course, also make sure to join our Discord community if you would like to talk to us and interact with us, and also to leave questions for our podcast in case if you happen to also support us on Patreon, because you get that little perk to submit questions to the podcast. And other than that, also follow us on our social media platforms so that you can learn about the latest Politdigm news. And as of currently, we have a bunch of cool stuff coming to Politdigm, specifically this channel. So I suggest that you subscribe and follow us on our social media platforms so that you are up to date with what the hell is going on with the channel. So yeah, let's get into the topics. Right. So I wrote some little, I have a little sheet in front of me with some like topics that I would like to talk about. And I would like to talk about specifically first the idea of utopian socialism. And this is very interesting because in this topic, when Engels starts talking about it, he's very much talking about the figures of then. Of course, the figures that he knew back then. He's not going to talk about a modern day representation of utopian socialism. But I feel like today, if in a modern representation of what I would like to represent socialism by, would be people who basically look at socialism, and instead of looking at it in a scientific way, they look at it, as something that is these kind of loose ideas that you want to impose onto society. And the best way that I can represent it is that, it's like as if one person had a good idea and basically goes, right, like this is socialism, we need to do socialism. I need to basically do socialism, and then everybody else around me will see how cool it is, and then they'll just kind of follow through with it. And whilst there's definitely some merit to that, you can definitely say, and as somebody who considers themselves a socialist, and for example, you would like to start a company or do whatever, you should definitely follow the socialist models, regarding cooperation and workplace democracy, et cetera, et cetera. But you should also know that that is not what's going to usher in socialism. That is merely a small thing in the larger picture, which is not going to be the catalyst which is going to dethrone capitalism and suddenly put socialism as the global economy. That's not going to it's not going to work like that. Um, but Engels talks about several different situations where basically stuff like this happened, where somebody would have an idea to make a different type of workplace, quote unquote, with the idea of workplace democracy, and generally socialist ideas, but that's it. That's all they did, because back then that's all that socialism was basically this utopian idea of instead of being quote unquote realistic or scientific, or in the case of what socialism define or Marxism defines it as being a scientific way of looking at it, it's a very idealistic way of looking at it. This idea that if you have a good idea, or that if you have enough people who can be converted into socialism, you'll suddenly be able to change people into socialists, or the world into socialism. It's not a very yeah, it just isn't scientific, or it isn't a very well planned out plan. More of like a kind of a utopian idea. That's basically where the name comes from. And so, of course, if Engels calls this utopian socialism, let's say, what then does he suggest? What must be done then? He, in the end, I believe it is of the second or the first part where he talks about utopian socialism, he talks about that there's a need for a scientific socialism, and that then for a scientific socialism to be defined, we need to create an entire analysis, right? An entire way of analyzing the world to be able to have a scientific socialism. And that's when he gets into dialectics. He talks about Hegel, which is the before Marx was basically the modern day philosopher who talked about dialectics, at least from my understanding, which then Marx took it and took it a bit further. Dialectics, or Hegel's dialectics, or the Hegelic model, I think it's the term. You can correct me in the description if you want. Basically, it was very idealistic, and when it comes to Marxism, when we talk about idealism, we're not talking about something that is perfect. It's not that definition, but rather something that is more in the idea, something that's not material, which is exactly the point. Is that it's antagonistic to, or not antagonistic, it's the opposite of of the material. So stuff that has to do with God and spirituality, and stuff that isn't palpable in the real world, but rather ideas. That's where the idealism comes from. And so Marx and Engels wants to focus on the material world, and specifically the dialectic materialism, and the dialectic process of development of society and the world, and this idea that that every facet of existence has these sort of three pillars of how everything is developed, which is the pillars of or Engels's pillars of dialectics, where he talks about the negation of the negation. He talks about the idea of basically having the thesis and the antithesis basically clashing against each other, and having a resolution of those two opposites. In the case of economics, we can see it as the working class and the capitalist class, or the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Those are two forces which are in contradiction to each other, which are clashing against each other. And one day we will hopefully have a resolution of the struggle between those two classes, and hopefully in through the lens of Marxist analysis, the solution to that class struggle is socialism. Until that solution comes along, we have our current world. Again, if I say anything wrong, please correct me. So yeah, there's dialectics, right? Dialectics, when he talks about dialectics, which is probably, well, it's, to me, it's probably the most interesting part about the book, but it's also the part that um, is for some reason to me right now less memorable. I'm not sure why, but at least maybe that's me. Um, but then, understanding dialectics and understanding the way of analyzing and understanding the world through the dialectic materialist lens, we can now correctly understand how the world works, and therefore we can develop a scientific socialism. And that scientific socialism is then based off of the dialectic materialist analysis of history, which is historical materialism, where it basically says, which is based on, or the other way around, or the first phrase of the Communist Manifesto is based off of this exact idea, which is that all hitherto history is the history of class struggle, basically saying that um, up until now, all of human history, for as long as we've had classes, there's always been a clash between two classes, this struggle. Again, the idea of dialectics, two opposing forces, one with one interest, one with another, constantly going against each other. Once in a while, there's a resolution of this, and a new generation, a new development, a new step of the human evolution, or the social evolution takes place. With the case of, for example, the death of feudalism, came capitalism, and then the idea is that with the death of capitalism comes socialism. At least that's what Engels is talking about. Of course, in modern day, for example, the last book that we read on the series talks about the idea that capitalism died and something much much worse came to replace it. But that's modern day. We're now focusing on what what Engels was talking about in the book. But exactly this idea of there being always two opposing forces clashing against each other, and coming with a resolution. The last chapter of the book, part three, historical materialism, the last episode, goes into the history of humanity, at least the more recent part of human history, and talks about the different the different class struggles that we had, and analyzes them and gets into the nitty gritty of them. Specifically, when it comes to, for example, the mode of production under feudalism and the mode of production and the capitalist mode of the production. In the feudalist mode of production, I'm not sure if that's the correct term, but the mode of production under feudalism, we basically had private production with then private appropriation, with the added caveat, which was that the feudal lords then took a percentage of that private appropriation, or that private appropriation. What that means is that those which produced a product also owns that product. Engels goes as far to talk about, for example, that even if, for example, the producer, like a hands craftsman, a craftsman, I don't know, I can't remember the term right now for some reason, but somebody who, for example, a carpenter, right? Somebody who makes chairs, I don't know, somebody who makes wooden chairs, they would make that chair, and then that chair was theirs, even if they had help, for example, from um, a helper, or somebody who is learning, like I'm forgetting the term right now, a apprentice, somebody who was there, basically in the role of somebody who's learning, who from the master, the one who is, who owns the business, or owns that little shop where they make chairs. They weren't the owner of the product they produced, because it was seen that their payment, or their what they received for helping, was basically what they had learned. So there's that, for example. But basically, under feudalism, there was the idea that, if somebody who makes wooden chairs made a wooden chair, then they'd own the wooden chair, and that then basically they had to, in some way, con- contributes to the feudal lords' shenanigans. In the case of wooden chairs, I don't know what it would be, but I guess it would be to produce wooden chairs for the kingdom or something. I don't know. That was, I guess, not a very great uh, analogy for me to choose. But the point is, when it comes to then capitalism, this is different because the production is no longer private. It's not on a person to person basis, it's rather a social production, right? Big factories with hundreds to thousands of people producing one product. And then this product is still under private appropriation. And in this case, it's of the owner of the business, right? The person who made the factory or owns the factory, the person who owns the company, whatever it may be. It is basically this. It is a group of people, the working class, the social production versus the private appropriation of the product. In the book, it's much better explained and in excruciating detail. And at some points, it even becomes a little confusing if you don't, if you only listen to it or read it once. At least that's the experience I had. I had to read the third part more than one time to understand it 100%, or at least understand it better. But yeah, he goes very much in detail when it comes to the social production versus the private appropriation and what that means, and that it is exactly those two things of social production versus private appropriation which creates the class struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And it is this part of history that we are living right now, which has this dialectic sense of two classes, or two contradicting forces going against each other, wanting to have a resolution, but they can't because they are, going against each other, basically that. And of course, at the end of the book, Engels talks about socialism, right? Goes back into the scientific socialism and tries to then say, okay, then what do we need, right? How do we solve this contradiction between social production versus private appropriation? And it is simple. It is social production and social appropriation. Basically, if there is social production, then the appropriation needs to also be social. And if there is production, if there is a social production, then that production needs to benefit the workers which made said production. The idea of the workers owning the means of production, in other terms, the idea of socialism. There you go. That's where it goes in. But of course, then we must go back to the question of utopian versus the scientific socialism, and what is the difference then? The difference is that scientific socialism is based off of an entire analysis, right? A historical analysis, something that it goes into the history of humanity and studies how humanity has developed and how we work, and that there's a clear pattern, almost a pattern, the dialectic pattern where things keep happening in a dialectic development, and that if that's the case, then there needs to be a dialectic solution to our current problem. Like every problem, there is a dialectic solution. And utopian socialism doesn't. Utopian socialism is basically, let's start a cooperative and let's hope that things go well. That's a very broad way to put it, but basically it's it's not as grounded in an entire analysis of history, which obviously makes it very different and less effective. But yeah, other than that, that's basically, I'd say, a nice little summary of what the book talks about in a very informal and chaotic way. I like the book. I very much like the last words and the like the last few paragraphs that Engels wrote. They kind of hit me personally. I don't know. There was something. They're very motivating, very moving, which I liked. But yeah, I like the book. It's a very much was a book which inspired me to look more into dialectic materialism and of course made me better understand historical materialism, which is of course an extremely important tool to understand. When being a Marxist, you need to understand historical materialism so that you can look at the current world and understand how things are going, how do we solve the problems that we have, etc., etc. But yeah, it's a great book. I recommend it. I recommend you go listen to our series. If you want to read it yourself, you can go to marxism.org, or just search up Friedrich Engels, Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific PDF, or just without the PDF, and you'll find an online version. So, very accessible book for everybody. So it's not like a modern book where you need to go buy it in your local library or whatever it may be. So if you want to read the book, it's relatively short. It's like 80 pages long, something along those lines. It's a great book. It's a great read, and gives you an idea of gives you to me it gave me a nice feeling, and it's a nice opening towards one understanding the principles of Marxism, of scientific socialism. Gives you a good introduction into dialectics, and a good introduction into reading other books about dialectics. For example, the other book that Engels wrote about dialectics, which is Dialectic Nature. I can never get the name of that book right, but that's a much larger book, which goes into dialectics. It also gives you some references to Marx. Engels talks about Marx a few times in that book, and talks about specifically stuff that he said that he wrote in Capital, and it goes into the more economic part of it, which is always interesting to get a taste of Marx's Capital. And yeah, it's a great book. I recommend you read it. I hope that you enjoyed this series. If you did, go watch it. Go have it. Go support the series. With that being said, next week, the week after this episode comes out, we are going to take a break. In fact, from here on out, after every book, we're going to take a break, purely because these are, at least to me, when I'm recording them, they are very tiresome to record. So I want to take a little break, and the team wants to take a little break. The next book that we're reading is a Marx book. We're reading. Hold up, let me get the book. We're reading Value, Price, and Profit. It's another short book, but it's this time by Marx. So I'm excited to read that on here. So expect that first episode of this book on I think it's the week of the 22nd. So the 26th of April. So yeah, thank you much for watching. If you want to support us, do so over at Patreon. If you'd like to do it in non-monetary ways, you can learn how to do that at our website. Join the public Discord server, interact with us, and follow us on our social media platforms. And yeah, that's it. That's all I have to say. So I'll see you all, not next week, but in 2 weeks. Goodbye, everybody.